Hi folks, my name is Linda Emmett and welcome to Happiness is an Inside Job. We are the creators of our own reality, we create our own lives. Our mind is our biggest limit and it's our own beliefs, behaviours and habits constantly caught in those cycles that keep us trapped where we are and stand in the way of our own happiness. So throughout this podcast, we're going to take a deep dive into some of those beliefs, habits and patterns, where they show up in your lives and what you can do to change them. Hi folks, I hope we're all doing super well, and on this week's podcast, following on from last week's, as part of our mini series by request from yourselves, we're going to continue looking at some of how our early childhood shapes and influences us both as children and as adults, and what positive change we can make to move ourselves out of behaviours we may have from some of our early imprints. So, firstly, we will, as always, dive into the how. I absolutely, truly believe, and I know I say this, but understanding is power. Understanding ourselves and what is triggering us, what is driving us, stops us feeling so afraid of it. We often feel out of control of our own emotions. We don't like negative sensations. So we end up pulling in behaviours to numb them out, to dull them down, or to escape them, which can actually create more pain in our lives rather than help us. And the part of that reason is a lot of the behaviours we pull in support us in the moment to get away from the emotion, like emotional eating, Netflix, numbing, gambling, sex addiction, alcohol abuse, smoking, whatever it is. It may help us escape the negative emotion or sensation in the moment, but usually in the longer term, it's hurting us, harming us, taking us away from our goals, possibly tearing away our self-worth and our believing in ourselves and driving feelings of failure. So one of the most amazing things that we can do for ourselves is to begin to understand our own emotions and sensations, where they come from, and from there we can begin to create the changes. So gaining an understanding of our early years and how we got to be how and where we are, that helps us understand ourselves and begin to treat ourselves with more compassion and more kindness, rather than blaming ourselves for being anxious or stressed or feeling like a failure. We also realise in that when you start understanding some of our behaviours, habits and triggers and where they come from, we also start spotting them easier in others. We also start seeing others' behaviours and how that might be impacting them, and how some of their childhood experiences are potentially showing up in how they attach now or how they react now. And this helps us be more compassionate towards other people. And most importantly, it's our start to begin creating a gorgeous, well-lit path to positive change, to building that happiness from within. Because that's the most important thing to us all in the end. Even when I work with clients and we break down the stories and what's going on, and you get to the root of what people want and what success looks like to them, one of the most predominant things that comes through is we want to feel happier. So going back and taking a look, developing that understanding hugely helps us in guiding us along that path to true lasting change. So what we'll do is we'll dive backwards again and look at the very early stages of our lives first. And for us all, as babies, as infants, we are like absolute sponges. Our brain is predominantly in theta state, absorbing everything that is going on around us. And what's going on around us is predominantly the environment we're with and in with our parents. Our mind is like a recorder and it's taking in everything that's going on around us, every image, every colour, every sensation, every experience. And from at infancy and when we're babies, it stores all this in our implicit subconscious memory. This is the first form of memory we have. So this is where our brain stores it. And at this stage, although our brain is recording everything, it can't go backwards and re-look at these things. It stores it as senses, as sensations in our system. And when we're born phenomenally equipped. Our brain and nervous system are massively equipped for every eventuality and every environment. It's set up for them. And if we're in a safe, loving, supportive environment, the brain, being super energy efficient, will prune away what it does not use, like some of our defense mechanisms. Where if we're in an environment where we are unsafe or our needs are not being met, the brain will engage and develop more those defense mechanisms. And this can show up in our later life as, triggers that we don't fully understand, hypervigilance, a heightened radar system to threaten our environments, which means our predominant state as adults is we're very guarded, we're living in a higher stress state, we're potentially more anxious, as the brain is still working off these early childhood defences. And if some of these defences were formed in implicit memory, what happens to us is we experience the sensation in our body when we're triggered, but don't necessarily understand why we're experiencing that, because it predates language in our brain. So it predates us understanding it in words or even creating a story about it. So we can get a reaction, an anxious or threat reaction within our senses, so within our body, our nervous system, and not fully understand why. And depending on what age we've been impacted by trauma or adverse childhood experience, abandonment, rejection, this shapes, depending on what age these situations impact us, it shapes how our brain and nervous system develop going forward. And from childhood, at different ages in our early years, different parts of our brain are forming. One of the first parts to form is our brain stem, our primitive brain. So our sensory motor skills and motor side, and hugely our survival mechanisms. The second part of the brain that'll start forming is our limbic brain. So that would be our attachment and our emotional development. And the third part is the cortical brain, the thinking, learning, language, and our ability to inhibit. So depending on the stage we are impacted by trauma or by negative experience, these can alter whatever is forming at whatever age we are at. Like in the previous podcast when we talked about attachment. If we're impacted at the age where our emotional development is forming, this can impact how our emotional development forms going forward, like our emotional regulation, how we regulate ourselves, how we manage our emotion. And I think for a lot of us, this one certainly shows up. A lot of what we do is we pull in things to regulate our emotions rather than understanding and managing them ourselves. One of the greatest fears that a lot of us have is feeling. And that's what leaves us where we are a lot of the time. We're afraid to go back and look and try to understand the roots of where this came from, recognize that we're no longer in that environment, so we don't need to respond and behave the way we did to survive, to protect ourselves, to be safe. And it's safe to change now. But until we go backwards and look at where it came from and develop that understanding, this helps us feel a bit safer about working with it, about doing the the inner work that we need to move ourselves forward and move our nervous system forward. It stops us doing the body work to start understanding our body. As children, one of the biggest things that children do when they experience threat, adversity, trauma, is they disassociate. They jump up into their heads because the body isn't potentially safe. And we can live then out into our later years feeling completely disconnected and ungrounded. So it really, really is valuable to start looking at where this started, how you're feeling within your own skin, how you're feeling internally, to make those changes to drive your own happiness. When we have a negative or adverse experience in childhood, it often creates an imprint. It's stored naturally. Trauma or adverse experience are stored differently to our everyday or happier experiences are stored. And our system is wired to do this, to keep us safe, for us to survive. It remembers them differently and imprints them differently in our system. So it recognizes these situations going forward, which is great in a way. It keeps us alive and surviving, but in another way, it can keep us as adults being triggered by similar situations that happened in our childhood, but when we were in a completely different space, when we were a child that couldn't protect ourselves the same way, when we couldn't speak the words or were in a completely different environment, but we still remain reacting the way we did decades ago because our brain and nervous system just have not learned anything differently. And the amazing tool we have is the power of neuroplasticity. Our brain can reshape and structure itself according to what you train it to do. So at any time, we can change up some of these behaviours and patterns that are not serving us. Now, I'm going to share with you a wee little story. So crack open the old popcorn there, just of an experience I had in my childhood and how I remember that and how it has shaped some of how I've grown up. Now, it's nothing dark or too dreary, but it's just, to broaden us up and give us more understanding. When I was about 3 or 4, I was after getting this big giant doll. Now, when I say giant, the doll would have been nearly my height. A big old plastic thing with short curly hair. Couldn't even brush her hair was that short, but I loved the doll. It used to kill me carrying her, but I carried her anyway. And her little arms and legs used to fall off at times, and I used to spend hours trying to get her leg back in. But anywho, there was one particular day, beside where we lived out in Finglas at the time, there was this, I want to say park, but it was actually all concrete. And I brought my doll round there and put her on the steps. And I had her lying down and I was feeding her grass, as you do. And this green snake, about a foot long, slithered across, green with big little eyes. Well, remember, I was 3 or 4, across the doll. I got such a horrible fright. I ran off, left the doll there, ran back to my house and out the back garden. And at the time, there was a party going on out the back garden. So all family, friends, all of them were there. I ran in sobbing. I said, there's a snake on my doll. I can't get her. I had to leave her. I was devastated. And most of the people there, they didn't believe me. They didn't believe it's not a snake, couldn't be a snake, not a snake. Some of them were laughing. And I still vividly, that memory is imprinted differently to any other memory I have. Well, some of the more traumatic ones, yes, but this particular memory is, I can remember the yellow cardigan, the green trousers, my hair, one of my uncles bending down and talking to me. How distressed, I can feel it. I can still feel my own system react now. I've a pain in my chest even telling you this. And nobody believed me. I was sobbing and they were all telling me there was no snake. To this day, guys, I vouch there was a snake on that doll. I found out years later that we can have a rare small little grass snake in Ireland, which is probably what it was. But I ended up more devastated by the fact that nobody believed me and that people were laughing and, yeah, not mocking me, but looking and, yeah, not understanding the distress I was in. They couldn't have. I was, looking back as an adult, but at the time, that shaped in some ways how I was going forward. And that shaped in some ways how I behaved as an adult when it came to asking for help. It shaped whether I would or wouldn't think I'd be believed, and how safe I felt asking for help. Because you have to remember, this is coming from a child's perspective, not an adult's. This is what the child sees and believes, and it imprints on the child from their understanding of what's going on in the environment. A child of 3 or 4, like the age I was then, is a very small child looking up at these adults for their very care, safety, survival, and love. And not every situation is super dark and filled with neglect or abandonment, but it does not mean they don't shape us in ways. It doesn't mean the boogeyman does not shape a lot of us not wanting to be in our houses on our own. Because in the back of our mind, there's a tiny part of us and that owl in our child thinking that, I don't want to not believe in the boogeyman just in case he appears. So as I mentioned, folks, these things do really, really shape us. So going back and looking at, and it may pop into your own heads, some of the things that you can remember and some particular things that stayed with you, because the imprints are certainly there, to begin you starting the healing process. And obviously, folks, as I'll dive into in the next podcast coming up as in the series, there can be more adverse traumatic experiences we can have within childhood, and we will dive a little deeper into that. But before we go there, we want to look at how we can start healing some of our experiences or some of how childhood shaped us from now. So to start the healing process, an amazing exercise we can do is sit with yourself. I know I'm always saying this, but we have a habit of running away from ourselves, of distracting ourselves, being on our phones, doing 100 zillion things to get our value. We can struggle to just sit with ourselves. So starting to learn to sit with yourself, take some time and space, and look at some of the more negative experiences with your parents in your life, as in where you feel they lacked, the ways that you feel they negatively impacted or failed you. And this is not about butchering all parents. It's not aimed at blaming. The parents we had, for some of us, were absolutely atrocious and it was a miracle we survived. But for others, our parents were doing the absolute best that they could from where they were and loving us and protecting us in the best ways they knew at the time. Even the boogeyman, as I mentioned earlier, parents used that to stop us going places that they thought we'd be threatened, hurt, or maybe to get us to listen, get up to bed, all of these things. There was possibly no negative intention behind it. Maybe they were tired, maybe they were a bit angry, whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean when we're going back and doing an exercise, looking at the negative impacts of our parents. It is solely to understand where it's showing up in your life now, to shine a light on what the more neglected parts were that were created within you, to begin the healing and integration of these parts. This is what we're looking to do here. We want to know how you internalized what happened and what it made you believe about yourself, how safe it was for you to get your needs met, what needs was it easier for you to get met, and what was your understanding. So it really is a powerful exercise, again, to start moving you from that space, that parts of you live in from decades ago, to get you living in the reality you have now and building from there. So that's it for me for this week, guys. I hope you really enjoyed it and got some fabulous takeaways. And as always, I invite you to connect in with me across social media, or check me out on my website www.yourgifttoyou.com, or email me linda@yourgifttoyou.com, guys, because I'd love to hear from you and any topics you'd like for us to talk about or any more learnings that you want. And please remember, give me those reviews because it keeps the podcast getting out there to more people. So chat to you very soon, guys. Bye bye.